So this is the introduction, the distinction between ideological oppression and repression. So there are different forms of oppression and injustice. We need to contrast repression, for example, slavery that is enacted by coercion typically, and ideological oppression is very often internalized ourselves. So I think that in the United States, gender is much more likely to be ideological oppression as opposed to repression, though oftentimes there will be a threat of coercion in the background. And so this is something that Kate Mann has talked about quite a bit in her notion of misogyny. They can also come in mixed forms. So I think there are times when you can have sort of repression on the part of the subject who's being repressed, but the people performing the repressive acts, they just do it habitually. Okay, so there are these different forms, and ideology, on my view, is best understood functionally. Ideology functions to stabilize or perpetuate power and dominance, and for some form of masking or illusion. As well, ideology critique takes two forms. First is the epistemic critique of ideology, and it reveals its distortions and misrepresentations of the facts. So ideology will misrepresent reality, so it is, and we take it for granted, for example. And then critique, or I mean political critique in this as well. So ideology is this dual thing. It's an epistemic mistake, it's an epistemic wrong that helps perpetuate moral wrongs or political wrongs. So I've argued elsewhere that ideology is not best understood in terms of shared beliefs, but is instead a set of cultural resources that we draw on to coordinate with each other in producing and distributing things taken to have value or disvalue. So I don't want to deny that sometimes ideology does form a set of beliefs. Explicit ideology can be held as a set of beliefs, but the real working of ideology is something that is kind of more basic than that, more basic than belief cognitively. So I embrace Stuart Hall's suggestion that ideology, and this is a quote from Hall, has especially to do with the concepts and the languages of practical thought, which stabilize a particular form of power and domination, or which reconcile and accommodate the mass of the people to their subordinate and sometimes dominant place in the social formation. So notice that languages of practical thought. So these are as a kind of toolbox, is what I'm going to be talking about, of practical thought that guides our practical orientation in the world. So when we go out on the street, or when we go into a store, or when we come home from work and all of this, we embody a kind of practical orientation. Certain things we notice, other things we don't, certain things we respond to, other things that we don't. And that kind of practical orientation that we have when we enter into a social space, that's going to be governed by the concept and languages of practical thought. And so the ideology is going to be in that domain. Okay, so my objectives in this paper are first to illuminate the phenomenon of ideological oppression and argue that efforts to achieve social justice must address culture. Our political efforts and the normative inquiry that guides them, particularly through political philosophy and political theory, should not be focused entirely on the possibilities of state action or other forms of policy change, nor should they be primarily focused on changing individual hearts and minds. So there is a domain in the middle between the state and the individual, and this is culture. And what I'm suggesting is that ethics has spent an awful lot of time talking about what individuals ought to do, and political philosophy has spent a lot of time talking about what the state ought to do. But there is a whole domain in the middle between the individual and the state, which is culture, and we need to do a lot more change in that domain of culture. Second objective is to claim that cultural critique depends both epistemically and pragmatically on social movements. So epistemically, we can adequately judge the hermeneutic failures of culture only through collective inquiry and counterpublics. And pragmatically, it's only through collective action that we can disrupt culture's coordinating power that keeps problematic social meanings and social norms in place. So acting alone, epistemically or practically, is not going to change culture unless, you have a magic wand. Even people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King, they're charismatic leaders, but they couldn't make the changes they made without being part of a collective effort to know certain things, to learn certain things, and to bring about change. And so it might seem obvious, but I'm going to be illuminating why I think that's important. Okay, so culture. What is culture? Now, this is a topic that, of course, sociologists and anthropologists and many political scientists, whatever, have studied. And of course, in the analytic tradition, tend not to think very well about it. And so I'm going to spend this next section talking about favor. So in mainstream moral philosophy, is either are entirely left out of the picture. So drawing on recent work in the social sciences, William Sewell argues that, here's a quote, the point of conceptualizing culture as a culture of, the point of conceptualizing culture as a system of symbols and meanings is to disentangle for the purpose of analysis the semiotic influences on action from other sorts of geographical, biological, technological, economic, and so on, that they're necessarily mixed with in any concrete sequence of behavior. Sit down to a meal, there are many different factors that determine what's going on there, what's happening there. So you're deciding what to eat, and it's going to depend on biological facts about us. There are certain things we can't digest. Geographical facts, sort of what grows around here or what is easily shipped to this area. It will depend upon demographic facts. What is your ethnicity, and what is the particular kind of food that people of that ethnicity or that class eat? And it's also going to depend, what Sewell is saying, on the semiotics of food. So semiotics is, I know it's a word that some people find a bit confusing, but just think about it as the social meaning of food. So for example, when you have a wedding reception, it's probably not the case that you're going to, have McDonald's for the wedding reception. Why? Well, McDonald's has a social meaning, and you want this to be a lofty occasion, a celebratory occasion. And so having McDonald's in many contexts isn't going to be sufficiently celebratory. Though in some contexts it might. It will depend. It might be like that's an expensive thing for a particular community to have, and so it feels like a gift to the guest to get the McDonald's. But for many people, it would just seem, a little crass. For example, in spite of the fact that, of course, our American president served as part of a celebration, Burger King to a football team as a celebration. Well, anyway, we don't need to get into him. He's a little bit more than we need to take on here, but you get the idea. The idea is that there's social meanings that are relevant in deciding what to wear. Like, you wear things because you want to signal certain things to the people around you. For example, your gender, or how hip you are, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so to elaborate, Sewell borrows Anne Swidler's suggestion that, quote, culture influences action by shaping a repertoire or toolkit of habits, skills, and styles from which people construct strategies of action, unquote. That, as Jack Balkin emphasized, tools are not necessarily designed for a single purpose and are often the site the source of new purposes. Okay, so we should not assume then that culture is coherent or that those who employ the tools have shared ends or act in solidarity. 1 second. I'm going to get this a little bit bigger. Culture is also a site of contestation and disruption. And because of this risk, meanings that sustain the status quo are managed and sometimes enforced. So the meanings are something that enable us to coordinate and act in solidarity, but they also are sites of contention. And so if people start contesting meanings, then solidarity and understanding and communication and coordination begin to fall apart. So on this account, cultures and network meanings, tools, scripts, schemas, background assumptions, etc., draw practices. It provides, as I said, a practice orientation for social agency. So to emphasize the tool, the term cultural techne. A cultural techne is this toolbox. It's a set of skills and it's a set of meanings, etc., that we draw on when we act in a social context. It's crucial to note, however, that a cultural techne is one part of a system that functions, not always successfully, to regulate our interactions in a domain, and it can't be understood apart from that system. So the basic emphasis here is, I think that societies are social systems, and we have to understand using the idea of a system. In a social system is going to be really important. Other parts of the system include resources, things such as material objects, time, and knowledge that are taken to have some positive or negative value, and the psychological capacities of humans and non-human animals to be responsive to and learn from each other. Okay, so here's all of us, we're people. We are trying to live together and coordinate with each other. And here is the idea that there are things that are valued, say this bunny rabbit, but it could be valued in different ways. It could be valued as a pet or as food or as a pelt. And this meaning enables us to interpret the bunny rabbit as valuable. And then the way we treat the bunny rabbit based on meaning reinforces our social meaning. So we breed them, if they're going to be pets, to be friendly and soft and fuzzy. If they're going to be food, we breed them to get fat, I guess. If we're going to be pelts, we breed them so that their fur is going to be, and so they'll make better pelts and they'll make better food. So there's a kind of looping effect between these meanings and the way the object evolve in the world. This bunny rabbit isn't just a bunny rabbit in nature, it's a bunny rabbit that's part of our social world. Okay, so then what happens, we have this cultural techne that gives us these options of pet or food or pelt, and we learn them, and then that we internalize as a kind of psychological schema. And that filters and shapes what we see, what we remember, how we interpret things, et cetera. And after, our perception and et cetera goes through that filtering, we form attitudes, typically attitudes for action, and we act on the resources. And then, as I mentioned, there is this looping that takes us back to reinforce the particular meanings. So it can happen for gender. So is this woman a friend, a mother, or a sex object? There can be different interpretations of what's valuable or not valuable about her, and that will, with our cognition and our affect, and then we will reinforce that by interacting with her in a certain way that reinforces the social meanings. Or here's another one, is the individual in the bottom box a friend, a janitor, or a criminal? We see people in certain ways filtered through our cultural techne, and then we interact with them in a certain way. And so there will be different social meanings that will be salient in different social contexts, but they will then reinforce in the kind of broad general culture certain attitudes that may be appropriate or may be inappropriate. So to put the point cynically, social practices create the sort of individuals needed to enact them, and they create them by our teaching each other how to interpret individuals, interact with them, and to be shaped by that interaction. Now, I'm saying a cultural techne is not in. That was the wrong one. Uh-oh. Okay. I guess that those for a few minutes. We can back. So not all cultural techniques are ideological. Only those cultural techniques are ideological that promote certain forms of injustice, moral wrong. Okay, so what are some consequences of this approach? So as my understanding, it's a practice first model for understanding the social domain. We have these practices. The practices of a cultural techne interacting with things that are taken to have value. We internalize these. These are public meanings, public, and this is necessarily something I just peculiar to me, a particular conception I have, but they're the ones that are public so that we rely on them when we interact with each other. So it's not a random collection of meanings, but is a frame for socially meaningful action and is a constituent part of the social regulation system. You know, we manage as well as we do, even though we're not doing so well right now, because we are trained to coordinate and cooperate with each other. And we interact with each other in predictable ways. We're not just sort of randomly behaving in relation to each other. And it really matters to us that we're legible to others, that we can be read to others in ways that we intend to be read. So cultural technes enable us to coordinate by providing the paths and signals that structure our practices and distribute things taken disvalue. So the role is explanatorily useful because the system is still. When we ask, why does the US suffer from enduring racial inequality? Is not because people share racist beliefs or have racial hatred. That simply pushes the question back. Why do they share those beliefs and attitudes? Why, especially, you know, for so long and in the face of good evidence that they're unwarranted, right? Why is this going on? Why is this so racism? And the answer is, well, the available practices, how we interact with each other, the culture and material resources shape us, our practices and beliefs to perpetuate the system. So you're only going to say, you know, people certain jobs except for the rare individual who's made it, right? And that's going to reinforce your beliefs that they're not cut out for those, you know, fancy jobs or research positions, etc. So a cultural techne not only informs and structures our practices, but also gives rise to different forms of subjectivity and frames our identities. And the social basis for identity also helps explain the resilience of the social structures. As Jack Balkin's a law professor at Yale, puts it, the tools of understanding work by becoming part of my apparatus of understanding, which is to say they work by becoming part of me. Human beings do not become persons until they enter into culture and become imbued with some form of cultural software. So his book is called Cultural Software. I don't use the term software. I think it can be misleading, but I think that we are social beings. We're cultural beings. We are encultured with a cultural techne that enables us to speak a language, understanding each other, not just in terms of verbally, but our body language, our signs and symbols, etc. So effective social change must not only provide incentives for acting differently, for example, through law, but must also replace the problematic practices and meanings with alternative meanings. And successful alternatives must have some continuity with the prior meanings so we can project ourselves into the new practices and new forms of life. So you can't just change everything all of a sudden. We have to evolve. Our cultural evolution is how it has to go. Although state action can provide incentives for change and can sometimes provide new hermeneutic resources, for example, Fricker talks about sexual harassment as a new hermeneutic resource, culture is a factor in the system that shapes and constrains what law, policy, etc. can do, right? So law can't just, change the meaning of a term and expect everybody to just follow right along. Sometimes it can, but not always. And moreover, state action can appear and be unwarranted and deeply destructive of who we are. So our identities are so significant to us and to our relations with each other that if the law oversteps its bounds, I'm not saying that it's not justified, but if it culturally oversteps its bounds, there can be tremendous backlash. So George Wallace clearly expressed this in 1963. I'm in favor of Brown v. Board of Education. I think it was the right decision by the Supreme Court. It was the law that mandated desegregation in public education. But here's an example. He says, this is a famous quote from George Wallace, "It's very appropriate that from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum for freedom, as have our generations of forebears before us, time and again down through history. Let us rise to the call for freedom-loving blood that is in us and send our answer to the tyranny that clanks its chains upon the South. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod the earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny. And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever." So law at that time had very little sway over many of the people who were in favor of segregation. They were going to fight it with all they had because it violated their sense of themselves and their identity, and also the norms that they were that they had internalized through a process of Althusserian interpolation or subjection. We won't go into that big, Althusserian words, but as they were socialized, and that the law, if it's going to be effective, it has to interact with what the background culture that is in place. And I think these are some of the issues that are very much at stake these days in the polarization of the United States, for example. Okay, so in short, social change cannot simply rely on policy and law and state intervention, and nor can it just rely on implicit bias training. Now that's a bit of a cheap shot, but I think a lot of people think, oh yeah, well, we just, we need to do implicit bias training and we'll all be okay. But the problem is that if the practices that we engage in collectively in the public rely on a bad cultural techne and ideology, there's nothing that's going to stop us in the way of implicit bias training. We need to cooperate and we need to coordinate, and so we will. Okay. All right, so that's really what I want to say about the first main point of the paper. So let me move on to the second, which is we need to consider culture when we're trying to promote social change. But then here's the question of ideology critique. So as I've mentioned, ideology, on my view, is a cultural technique gone wrong. It organizes us in ways that are unjust and or in ways that skew our understanding of what is valuable. This is partly an epistemic problem. Ideology prevents us from knowing who and what matters. It is also a political problem. The ideological techne guides practices that together constitute unjust structures. So what we need to do is think about that practical side of it as well, the way in which how we think and act distorts what we do. And this, of course, creates a loop, the epistemic and political, because the unjust practices then in turn shape our capacities to have knowledge of who and what matters. So our minds are shaped, our consciousness is shaped, which shapes our action, which changes the world, which shapes our knowledge, right? What we can know. In context of ideological oppression, the problem is not that the individuals who participate in the injustice, who either suffer from, perform, or are complicit in it, are stupid or ignorant. Even epistemic responsibility within the available techne is often insufficient to appreciate the wrongs it enables. Okay, so epistemic responsibility, so think of it this way. If you think that women are better nurturers than men, that's supported by the evidence, right? So, and why is it supported by the evidence? Because we do most of the nurturing. right? We nurture the elderly, the young, the disabled, et cetera, et cetera. And the sick. Women do so much of this nurturing work. It would be ridiculous epistemically to say, oh no, you shouldn't believe any of that, even though this is what seems to be supported by the evidence. So that's what I'm saying. Once ideology takes hold and changes the world to conform to it, ideology makes itself true, then it would be epistemically responsible if just looking at the facts around you to start disbelieving it. So the people who are complicit are not stupid or ignorant. Moreover, because the cultural techne not only informs cognition, but also agency in the sense of self, participation in injustice appears called for, not as such, not as injustice, but it appears that this is what we ought to do. This is how we ought to go on, because this is how I am. This is who I am. Okay, and then moral critique can easily backfire. But can we be more specific? How then do we go about ideology critique? So for example, should we engage in mainstream epistemology or rational choice theory, et cetera, to sort of dislodge ideology? And I think we can critique as misrepresentations many of the beliefs that ideology produces. But given the idea that the problem we are addressing is a practical orientation, much more is needed. I mean, another way to put it is if you think that what's going on is that we are within a kind of a framework or a form of life that has certain salient categories and certain salient norms, then it's not the case that what we have to be looking for is, what's true and what's false. What we have to look for is, are these the right categories for us to be using in thinking about the social world? Are these the right norms we should be on when we coordinate? And that's different from what a lot of the mainstream epistemologists are looking at. Okay. So if our shared practices depend on the local mind shaping that enables us to coordinate, then there will be pressure for individuals to continue to act on the outputs of those cognitive mechanisms. We've been shaped to think and see and remember certain sorts of things. And so there's going to be tremendous pressure to continue that, whether or not the attitudes are epistemically warranted or not. So this is a kind of practical problem. And if the practices have been effective in shaping the world, then attempting to change the belief will look epistemically unwarranted. Moreover, when internalized by individuals, ideology provides tools for psychosomatic self-regulation and enables fluent coordination. It structures our subjectivity. Because of its regulative function, it has normative force. So if you say to someone, oh, you got to quit doing it that way, but not doing it that way will lead to a kind of chaos and disruption that's going to look like, no, practically speaking, you ought to just continue. So this is a problem with a lot of collective action problems. We're stuck in a bad equilibrium, and a few people trying to move away from the equilibrium or trying to radically change the equilibrium may well create much worse conditions, right? But the equilibrium that we're in is bad. So how do we get past it? Okay, so to disrupt a cultural technique that promotes injustice, we need to establish new practices that enable us to both discover and create value. Reasoning with people is not going to be enough. Okay, so this is this kind of idea of evolution. You don't just try to talk someone out of their everyday practices and then expect them by themselves to change the practice and then sort of try and build from there. No, you've got to show people a different way of doing things. You've got to invite them into a different set of practices. So how then is critique possible? Let's consider Bourdieu very briefly. Bourdieu distinguishes doxa, heterodoxy, and orthodoxy. Okay, so doxa is the universe of the undiscussed or the undisputed, and the universe of discourse or argument or the field of opinion is going to be within the oval with heterodoxy on one side and orthodoxy on the other. And this is the domain of contestation. Is same-sex marriage legitimate? Is it not legitimate? Is abortion legitimate? Is abortion not legitimate? all of those sorts of, is Black Lives Matter legitimate or illegitimate? That's the domain, the field of opinion, as opposed to the universe of the undisputed. And so doxa doxa includes not only background assumption, but the terms and taxonomies that structure or frame what is available to be believed or contested. And the line between the field of opinion and the doxa is a crucial site of social struggle. The line around the oval is a crucial site of social struggle. We can disrupt the system by making the doxa explicit and available for contestation, or by making what was heterodox or mere opinion part of doxa. So if it was heterodox, so nowadays the heterodoxy of same-sex marriage seems to be moving into dogma in the sense that it's taken for granted, but it was for a long time heterodoxy. So this was Bourdieu's view, and he tended to think that what we ought to do in social critique is make explicit, bring things out of doxa into the field of opinion for contestation. Okay, and share, stop share. That's my last share, so. Okay, so the model, I think, is not adequate as it stands. And on the handout, I have a grayed out section that I could talk about, but I'm not going to. So the main point I want to make about this is that Bourdieu represents doxa as if it is constituted by consensus and is unanimous. He says each agent tacitly accepts the doxa by the mere fact of acting in accord with social convention. But as James Scott has argued, things are always and thankfully much more complicated. So here's a quote from Scott. He says, every subordinate group creates out of its ordeal a hidden transcript that represents a critique of power spoken behind the back of the dominant. The powerful, for their part, also develop a hidden transcript representing the practices and claims of their rule that cannot be openly avowed. A comparison of the hidden transcript of the weak with that of the powerful, and of both hidden transcripts to the public transcript of power relations, offers a substantially new way of understanding resistance to domination, unquote. So at least within the field of opinion, perhaps also within the doxa, we should include a distinction between the public transcripts from the hidden transcripts. The distinction encourages us to locate sites and forms of resistance that provide resources for ideology critique. So counterpublics are extremely important. So if you think of Stonewall in the LGBTQ uprising, Stonewall and gay and lesbian bars and trans bars, these are places that are counterpublics where there is a hidden transcript about patriarchy, about heteronormativity, about all of these things. And there are different practices that are explored in these sites that are resistant to the dominant frame of understanding. Moreover, the differences between public and hidden transcripts can illuminate how cultural domination functions in the public sphere, for example, by silencing, distortion, and marginalization. Resistance revealed in hidden transcripts can attest to the limits of a dominant ideology, thus avoiding the presumption that we're merely cultural dupes and the anxiety that hegemony is so complete that social change is impossible because it's unthinkable. That's one of those issues that people have worried about. Once you get a theory of ideology, it's so hegemonic and complete, then we're all, just little automata of the system. We're little robots. And so we can't do anything but sort of maintain the system through our robotic actions. But this isn't the model. And it isn't the model, also the idea of a toolbox, culture as a toolbox rather than as a script. These are things that are going to help us understand how even under ideological conditions we can undertake critique. So on Scott's view, hidden transcripts emerge as a form of resistance. He's primarily thinking about not the hidden transcripts of the dominant, but the hidden transcripts of the weak, the hidden transcripts of the subordinate. And this resistance is the source of hidden transcripts. But of course, he has to allow, and he did allow in the quote I gave above, that the dominant have their hidden transcripts too. They're going to talk about, it's kind of like Trump when he was interviewed by Woodward and saying, yeah, well, I'm just trying to prevent panic. You know, I know the coronavirus is going to be deadly, but I don't want to panic everybody. That's a kind of hidden transcript of the dominant in that context. Okay, so although one source of hidden transcripts is resistance, and others is amongst the dominant, another source lies in the conflicting demands of different practices. And moving between different social milieu, we engage in practices that situate us in different roles. A single individual might be a mother at home, a choir director at church, a cashier at Walmart, and a student at a community college. The norms for interaction and the meaning of one's actions differ dramatically between these settings. And some hidden transcripts emerge just in an effort to make sense of our lives. An experience in one setting can give resources, meaning, etc., to the others. So you go to work and you say, wow, this is so much better than being, well, a woman, say, who is used to being a stay-at-home mom, she goes to work and she goes, oh, wow, this is so much better than staying at home because, look, I get respect for what I do and I can be paid and I can, you know, work my way up in a ladder of prestige. That's not something that happened at home. But then she goes home and she says, oh my God, this is so much better at work because I have such autonomy over what I do, what I wear, these sorts of things. I can decide, sure, I have to take care of the kids, but I decide when they have lunch, et cetera, et cetera. So these ways of comparing these different domains of life and work can sort of give you the resources of saying, well, the work environment is too rigid, the home environment lacks, you know, appreciation. And so you can begin to get hidden transcripts developed from those tensions between them. So again, on the handout, I'm going to go pass over a grayed out area so that I can leave plenty of time for discussion. So it seems that critique can emerge even under conditions of ideology. The doxa may fix certain social categories, assumptions, and norms in ways that distribute resources unjustly. The powerful will be better positioned to shape the social meanings and define what falls within the categories and shape the social norms. And yet resistance provides insight into the failures of dominant social meanings, norms, and practices. Because you're resistant, you're resistant to participating in full faith in the practices that you're asked to. You say, look, why do I have to wear, you know, business dress just to go and sit at a desk all day, right? That's stupid. It's expensive. I don't want to do it, you know, things like that. Such resistance emerges in counterpublics and through consciousness raising, which involves collective reconsideration of our hermeneutic resources and the development of alternative paradigms. And I don't mean just so, you know, there's a lot of research on the white women's movement in the 1960s, where white women would get together in playgrounds and complain about, you know, their husbands and their children and these sorts of things. And that would evolve slowly into a sense that they were entitled to something different, and then to sort of see what might happen if they tried to do things differently, if they went to work instead of staying home with the children. An epistemology of consciousness raising must provide resources to distinguish apt from inapt, just from unjust changes to our paradigms. I'm not going to talk about that much today, but I can in the discussion period. Also, there's a paper on my website if you want to read it. It's called Political Epistemology and Social Critique, where I go into more detail here. But I think we do need to be aware that not all supposed consciousness raising is really consciousness raising. Sometimes it's consciousness lowering, if you're an anti-vaxxer, for example. And moreover, the claims of a social movement are not dispositive. They don't, you know, just because a social movement says we have to do X, that everybody has to just toe the line and fall into and cooperate with that particular recommendation, because they are at best tanto claims against others who are party to collective self-governance. So if a group says, look, we're not going to take this anymore, then it's what we do next is something that has to be resolved through political process, hopefully just political processes. Okay, so kind of wrapping up, epistemology is not just about individuals and what knowers can share. but also about the construction of knowers through social and cultural practices. To ignore this is to allow ideology to do its work unnoticed and unimpeded. Moreover, critique cannot simply challenge belief, but must involve the challenges to those practices through which we ourselves become the vehicle and embodiment of ideology. So in conclusion, how should we interpret the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and the Black Lives Matter movement? It's important to gain the support of and train elites so that you can convince lawyers to take your case to the Supreme Court and to lobby legislators to pass new laws, even though if things go like they might seem, it's not going to help to go to the Supreme Court with your case because the Supreme Court will be packed. Laws and other state action are often effective in incentivizing more just and less harmful behavior. Social movements, though, seek cultural change, a reorganization of our society around different values, a restructuring of our practices so that we're positioned to recognize the value of new or different things and coordinate on just terms. In short, an important form of social critique begins amongst at least some of the practitioners of a practice, a resistance to the practice that they're being asked to perform. Resistance can produce knowledge that even if the practice constitutes some sort of value, it is harming them in ways that are morally problematic. It may be that the values the resistant rely on were making claims of being harmed or at odds with what others engaged in the practice value. But as long as their resistance is grounded in fact and sound epistemic norms, that does not delegitimize their claims. Practices are cooperative enterprises, and if parties to the cooperation have reason to think they're being treated unjustly or their values are undermined, there is reason at the very least for all parties involved to reconsider the practice. In other words, further political processes will be required to determine what to do next. It may be too much to ask for the consent of all those engaged in the practice, but insisting on terms of cooperation in the face of non-consent is coercive, and it is a pro tanto wrong. This is the normative basis for contentious politics, and the paradigm case of contentious politics is the social movement. Thanks very much.